I think everybody went to the polls on November the 7th, 2000, not thinking that anything unusual would happen. I mean, Florida is known for its weird occurrences. Weird news seems to be what Florida does. But I don't think anybody ever expected that the election between Bush and Gore would turn out to be the squeaker that it ultimately became. When I got up early the next morning, everybody was talking about Florida and about the vote wasn't final in Florida, which I couldn't conceive of at that point. I actually went down to the front desk to see if I could find newspapers, and I found several different copies of the Orlando Sentinel with different headlines. One said that Gore had won, one said that Bush had won, and one said too close to call. So I came back and checked with the Associated Press Bureau here in Tallahassee, and they told me that in fact Florida was still in play and might be for some time. And at that point I called the Chief Justice, Charlie Wells, and asked what was going on, and the response was simply get back here to Tallahassee as fast as you can.
I'm in Miami on election night, writing, in this case, the presidential election in Florida. In other words, how Florida voted in that race, and you know, just the normal things, how whoever carried the state won the state. Normally, on election night, by 2 or 3, we've wrapped up and you head back to your hotel and get up in the morning, come back into the Miami Bureau and make sure everything's cool, and if it is, I fly back to Tallahassee. That's on a few hours of sleep. About 4 o'clock in the morning on election day in 2000, it was like, we have got a mess. Obviously, we didn't know who had won. There was no sleep that night. At about 8 in the morning, we decided, and I'm still in the Bureau, Brent, I'll be back in Tallahassee. It's going to be kind of an interesting place. Well, I couldn't get on a flight right away, but I was back by about 3 in the afternoon, stayed in the Bureau till 11. That was the start of about a 5-week period for everybody. Worked probably 16, 17 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was really just new seas to sail. Nobody had an experience like this. Now we've had close Senate races, and we've had close gubernatorial races. And in fact, 88 was the closest Senate race in Florida history when Connie Mack beat Buddy McKay. In 94, Childs won re-election over Jeb Bush in the closest governor's race in history. So maybe they were good, good runs for this, for those of us that were around for all of them. But never with the attention and the pressure and the importance of what was the biggest story in the world for over a month.
When I first got back here from Orlando on the morning of November the 8th, no one really knew what was going on, but it was pretty clear in Tallahassee that something odd was happening, because there was movement all over the Capitol complex that you don't normally see. And to set the scene, reporters were here knowing that the presidency of the United States was at stake. World history was on an edge. But nothing was happening for days, hours on end. And these are 24-hour news networks now, 24-hour news holes to fill. And so they were looking for any kind of news. And so they started gravitating over to the Florida Supreme Court before we really became the focus of attention. That concerned our marshal at the time, who was a former full colonel, and being a proper military man, he responded by locking all of our doors. I was outraged because I thought that this really diminished the appearance of openness that we had worked so hard to cultivate. And of course, that was part of my job. It was one of the reasons why my job had been created. And so I took the matter to the Chief Justice. I brought the marshal in with me, and to get a final resolution from the guy at the top. And the Chief Justice basically told me he was not willing to countermand what his top security officer had done. And his response was, well, Craig, why don't you just go out and talk to the press? And that was the very humble beginning of me going out and briefing the press on what was happening.
Hello, I'm Craig Waters, spokesman for the Florida Supreme Court. The court today has issued its opinion in the case of Albert Gore Jr. versus Katherine Harris, George W. Bush, and others.
I think it was very fortuitous, though, that this happened in the state of Florida, but also in particular that it happened at the Florida Supreme Court, because we were at the cutting edge of openness with the public and the press. I'm a former journalist myself. I was a journalist before I went to law school. And I was hired by the Supreme Court right out of law school. But because of my prior experience being in the press over time, the court had increasingly relied on me in questions of media relations. So over a period of time, I kind of evolved into the position that I currently have, which is the spokesman, the public information officer for the Florida Supreme Court. Partly because of that and my prior journalism background, which involved a lot of computer use, I had gotten involved in the internet very early and actually created the court's first website in 1995, which was very, very early at that point in time. Many people still thought the web was something of a fad that would probably just go away. So we already had this experience of being on the web for 5 years before Bush v. Gore hit us. On top of that, in 1996, my boss at the time, Gerald Kogan, asked me if I would take on a project to put all of our oral arguments on television, live television, broadcast on cable, via satellite, and on the World Wide Web, which we achieved by 1997. And so, as fate would have it, we had 3 years' experience of broadcasting every single one of our oral arguments here at the Supreme Court of Florida by the time the crazy vote on November the 7th, 2000 hit us here in Florida.
Florida was a total Democratic state until the early 90s. And in 92, the Republicans took control of the state house. In 94, the Republicans took care of, and I might be off 2 years on this, it might have been 92, it was a tie, 94, the House, 96, the Senate, and then in 98, Governor Bush was elected, a Republican. So by 1998, from this brief period, within a decade, you went from total control of the cabinet, the executive branch, and legislative branch as Democrat, to total control by Republicans. Through that period, there were increasing pressure by the Republicans in particular to be critical of the court, if not hostile. But there wasn't a lot of love lost there, and I think the legislators felt like every time that the court made decisions unfavorable to them that they were taking away their rights to legislate. Now, saying that, the court, I don't ever remember an instance of a Florida Supreme Court justice even getting into an awkward position in terms of criticizing the legislature. But it was pretty clear they were on different sides here, so it was easy enough to follow that what the legislature was doing, they were either ignoring the court or they were going to try and circumvent the court. The court, I think, was acting certainly well within they were following their own judicial philosophies pretty much, but I think, it's also impossible for them to ignore politics.
The Florida Supreme Court and its justices felt very well about how we were portrayed as an institution facing a national crisis. The one thing you don't want to do in any situation is look like you were disorderly, or you're out of control, or you can't control what's going on around you. And I think we did a very good job of making sure that everything was as orderly as it possibly could be. You did not have, as you had at the U.S. Supreme Court, reporters running out onto the steps trying to read an opinion they had just gotten a copy of and saying really stupid things simply because they could not have the time to read or have a simple digest of what the opinion said. That's one reason why there were so many misunderstandings about what the U.S. Supreme Court had done when it ruled, was because the initial reports coming from the reporters were all over the board. They were the result of extremely partially digested information. And it was all because of the way the U.S. Supreme Court handled those releases. Here at the Florida Supreme Court, because we decided we were going to give the press a bottom line, we didn't have that. I would go out, I would make the announcement, and the announcements would almost never be longer than 2 or 3 minutes. It's all the time it took. And as a result of that, people around the world and in the press would know the bottom line of what the Florida Supreme Court had done. No one was standing around speculating and trying to talk on a live camera or a live microphone while they're also trying to read what it is that they're talking about. We didn't have to deal with that, and it created this impression, I think, of competence in the way we were administratively handling the matter. You can disagree with the Florida Supreme Court's opinions as much as you want. We knew that from the very beginning. With the country as evenly divided as it was over that presidential election, you were going to alienate half the people no matter what you did. That was a given. But the one thing we could control, and that we did control, was the way that information was released to the public. It was released quickly, succinctly, and professionally. And as a result of that, I think that created a very favorable impression of the court.
The opinion of the court is unanimous.
The taste for anything that came out during that it'd be instantly reported. In other words, the hunger for any type of little tidbit of news was a big deal. Oh, Senate President in Florida saying this, or the House Speaker saying this. The one thing the court did not do, of course, other than its decisions, they didn't talk about stuff. And in Florida, where we have very favorable open government laws, it's unlike, and I've worked in 8 or 9 states for the AP over a 40-year period. There's no other state quite like it. It makes it harder, I think, as a journalist to get a scoop because so much is public and available. And so many of the politicians are used to reporters sitting in on meetings that you're almost the proverbial fly on a wall. Now, saying that, there's some still that are secretive and want to go in the back room of a pub someplace and violate the public records law. But by and large, it's a state to work that if you're a journalist, there's a lot more information readily available to you because the state has some very aggressive open records laws. And Florida's elections have improved. I mean, they're far better than what they were, and when you couldn't even tell if a person had voted or not on so many ballots. And the most memorable image of that, I think, being the supervisor down in Palm Beach County looking through his glasses, through magnifying glasses. His eye was that big, but he couldn't even see. He couldn't tell whether or not that little old Chad was hanging or dropped out, or was it a vote or not a vote, And it was embarrassing. I think certainly for the political professionals, or at least the elections professionals, to have, what does the rest of the world think of this? Where you get, it's the in this case, we're in the 21st century. So Florida's taken a lot of steps, but now saying that, 13 years later, there's still a lot of issues and there's a lot of politics going on. The elections, the Secretary of State in Florida is now appointed by the governor. It used to be an elective office. And so there's plenty of politics that goes on. Now the county supervisors are independently elected. And so they don't always do exactly as they're told by a politically appointed Secretary of State. They have to be careful, of course, but there's a lot of pushback because they're pros, and by and large, regardless of party affiliation in Florida, the county election supervisors have been very nonpartisan.
If you want to look at what caused this situation, it was a statute that was drafted without any thought about this enormous historical situation that ultimately would arise. I don't know who you can blame for that. You can't always blame legislators for badly drafted statutes, especially for not foreseeing what was a situation that most people would say was unimaginable. I can't tell you how many times people have told me that if you wrote a novel based on Bush v. Gore, assuming Bush v. Gore had never really happened, that no one would believe it because it was so improbable. I mean, our governor was the brother of one of the candidates, and our cabinet, the state cabinet, was evenly divided, serving as honorary chairs of one candidate or the other. It was insane to imagine that. And then to have the situation where 67 canvassing boards around the state could decide separately how to count votes. Keep in mind, these canvassing boards consisted of minor local officials, minor local officials. And they were deciding the standards by which a president would be chosen. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the fact that Florida had these 67 different standards violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And I have no fault with that. That makes perfect sense to me. Having 67 different standards within the same state, that's crazy. And so the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, to me, in retrospect, makes perfect sense as well. So I think in the long run, historians are going to view what happened here in Florida during Bush v. Gore as a series of circumstances so bizarre that nobody could have predicted, and that all of the institutions involved probably dealt with as best they could in the situation. I really believe in the good faith of all people who were involved in this. I may disagree with some of the methods they used. I disagree with the U.S. Supreme Court's lack of openness, because I feel like openness has worked a great deal for the people of Florida and has been a great benefit to this court. But when you get down to the bottom line of what people were doing and in trying to resolve this massive question that would decide who a president was, I think everyone acted in good faith.
We have instructions from the highest court in the land, and our judges are bound to obey the law of the land. Thank you.